The bitter January wind howled through the streets of London as Guardsman David Thompson adjusted his heavy red coat and pulled his bearskin hat lower against the freezing gusts. It was his third year serving as a royal guard at Buckingham Palace, and he had grown accustomed to standing motionless for hours in all kinds of weather. But this particular Tuesday evening was different. The temperature had dropped to -12 degrees Celsius. The coldest London had experienced in over a decade. David's shift was supposed to end at 8 o'clock, but his replacement had called, and sick with flu, leaving him to extend his duty until midnight. The palace grounds were nearly deserted, except for the occasional tourist brave enough to venture out in the brutal cold to take photographs of the iconic guards. Most sensible people had retreated indoors hours ago, leaving the streets eerily quiet and covered in a thin layer of ice that sparkled under the street lights as the clock tower chimed 10:30. David noticed movement near the palace gates that caught his attention. A small figure was walking slowly along the sidewalk, moving in an unsteady pattern that immediately raised his concerns. His training had taught him to observe everything while maintaining his ceremonial stillness. Cell stillness. Movements suggested distress. The figure appeared to be a young woman, probably in her early 20s, wearing what looked like inadequate clothing for the extreme weather conditions. She wore only a thin jacket, jeans, and sneakers that were clearly not designed for walking on icy surfaces. Her movements were becoming increasingly erratic, and she seemed to be stumbling more frequently as she made her way along the fence surrounding the palace grounds. David's military instincts began to override his ceremonial duties. While royal guards were expected to remain motionless and focused on their primary responsibility of protecting the royal family and palace grounds, they were also trained soldiers who understood that human life took precedence over protocol when circumstances demanded action. Through his peripheral vision, David watched as the young woman stopped walking and leaned heavily against the palace railings. She stood there for several minutes, swaying slightly, and he could see that she was shivering violently, even from his position several meters away. Her breath created large clouds of vapor in the frigid air, and her movements suggested that she was losing coordination, classic signs of hypothermia that David recognized from his military survival training. The woman appeared to be alone, no friends or family members nearby who might help her. The streets were completely empty except for the occasional taxi or delivery vehicle. Their drivers focused on getting to their destinations as quickly as possible, rather than stopping to check on pedestrians. David realized that he might be the only person in the immediate area who had noticed her. It's a deteriorating condition. As he continued to monitor the situation while maintaining his official position, David began to weigh his options. Royal guards operated under strict protocols that governed their behavior while on duty. They were not supposed to break their ceremonial stance, except in cases of genuine emergency that directly threatened the security of the palace or the safety of the royal family. Moving from his post without proper authorization could result in serious disciplinary action, including potential dismissal from the prestigious position he had worked years to achieve. However, David's conscience and his training as a soldier were telling him that this situation was rapidly becoming a life-threatening emergency. The woman's condition was clearly deteriorating, and the extreme cold meant that every minute of exposure increased her risk of serious injury or death. He had seen cases of severe hypothermia during his military service, and he knew that people could lose consciousness and die from exposure in conditions much less severe than what London was experiencing tonight. The woman suddenly stumbled and nearly fell, catching herself on the iron railings at the last moment. David could see that she was struggling to maintain her balance and that her movements were becoming increasingly sluggish. Her head was drooping forward and she seemed to be having difficulty keeping her eyes open, advanced signs of hypothermia. That indicated she was in immediate danger. David made a split-second decision that would define not only the rest of his evening, but potentially the rest of his career. He knew that his commanding officers would need to review his actions, and that breaking protocol while on ceremonial duty was a serious matter that could have consequences for his military record. But he also knew that he was possibly the only person in a position to save a human life, and that some things were more important than following rules. taking a deep breath and saying a quick prayer that he was making the right choice. David began to move from his post for the first time. In over 4 hours, his muscles protested after the long period of motionless standing. But his training kicked in immediately as he assessed the situation and began formulating a plan to help the young woman before it was too late. As he stepped away from his ceremonial position, David felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was about to discover that sometimes the most important battles, soldier fights, have nothing to do with warfare and everything to do with simple human compassion. In the face of life-threatening circumstances, David moved quickly but carefully across the icy pavement, his heavy military boots providing better traction than most footwear would have in these conditions. As he approached the young woman, he could see that her situation was even more critical than he had initially assessed. Her lips had turned blue, her skin was pale and waxy, and she was shaking uncontrollably in a way that indicated her body was struggling to maintain its core temperature. When he reached her, David spoke in a calm, authoritative voice that was designed to reassure rather than alarm. He identified himself as a member of the Royal Guard and explained that he had noticed she appeared to need assistance. The woman looked up at him with glassy, unfocused eyes that struggled to register his presence. When she tried to speak, her words were slurred and difficult to understand, another clear sign of advanced hypothermia. Through her mumbled responses, David was able to piece together that her name was Emma Richardson. She was 23 years old. She had been walking for several hours after becoming separated from her friends during a night out. Emma explained that she had lost her purse, including her phone and money, when she fell on the ice earlier in the evening. She had been trying to find her way back to her apartment, but had become increasingly disoriented as the cold affected her mental clarity. David quickly realized that Emma was suffering from moderate to severe hypothermia and needed immediate medical attention. Her core body temperature had dropped to a dangerous level, and her body was no longer able to generate enough heat to maintain normal function. Without prompt intervention, her condition would continue to deteriorate rapidly, potentially leading to cardiac arrest, coma, or death. The nearest hospital was St. Mary's, approximately 15 minutes away by ambulance under normal conditions. However, the extreme weather had created hazardous driving conditions throughout the city, and David knew that emergency response times were likely to be significantly longer than usual. He also recognized that Emma might not have 15 minutes to spare. Her symptoms were advancing quickly. She needed to begin warming immediately. David made the decision to move Emma to the Palace Guard Station, a small heated building located just inside the palace grounds, where guards could take breaks and access emergency equipment. This decision required him to temporarily abandon his post and bring a civilian onto restricted palace property, both serious breaches of protocol that could result in severe disciplinary action, supporting Emma's weight as she struggled to walk. On unsteady legs, David guided her through the security checkpoint and into the guard station. The warmth of the heated building provided immediate relief, and Emma's violent shivering began to subside slightly as her body started responding to the change in environment. David immediately contacted the palace medical officer, Dr. Patricia Wells, who maintained a small medical facility on the palace grounds for treating injuries and illnesses among staff and guards. Dr. Wells had been on duty that evening, working late to catch up on administrative paperwork. When she received David's urgent call for assistance, within minutes, Dr. Wells arrived at the guard station with a medical bag and emergency warming equipment. Her initial assessment confirmed David's diagnosis of severe hypothermia. Emma's core body temperature had dropped to 34 degrees Celsius, well below the normal range, and she was showing signs of altered mental status and decreased motor function that indicated her condition was life-threatening. Dr. Wells immediately began warming protocols, removing Emma's wet clothing and wrapping her in specialized thermal blankets, designed to gradually raise her body temperature without causing shock to her system. She started an IV line to provide warm fluids directly into Emma's bloodstream and began monitoring her vital signs closely for any indication of cardiac irregularities that could be triggered by rapid temperature changes, while Dr. Wells worked to stabilize Emma's condition. David contacted emergency services to request an ambulance for transport to the hospital. The dispatcher informed him that response times were significantly delayed due to the extreme weather conditions and multiple emergency calls throughout the city, but that paramedics would arrive as soon as possible. David also had to make the difficult decision to contact his commanding officer, Major Robert Sterling, to report that he had abandoned his post and brought a civilian onto palace grounds. Major Sterling was initially concerned about the protocol breaches, but when David explained the life-threatening nature of the emergency, the major's military training and humanitarian instincts took precedence over disciplinary concerns. As they waited for the ambulance, David stayed with Emma, talking to her continuously to help keep her conscious and alert. He learned that she was a university student studying social work, that she had moved to London from Manchester just 6 months earlier, and that she had been celebrating a friend's birthday when she became separated from her group. Emma's condition began to stabilize under Dr. Wells' care, but she remained weak and disoriented. Her speech became clearer as her body temperature rose, and she began to understand the seriousness of her situation. She expressed amazement and gratitude that David had noticed her distress and had been willing to risk his career to help a complete stranger. The warmth of the guard station, the medical attention, and David's constant reassurance were beginning to have their effect. Emma's color started to return to normal, her shivering became less violent, and her mental clarity improved noticeably. However, Dr. Wells emphasized that she still needed hospital treatment to ensure that no permanent damage had occurred, and to monitor for any delayed complications from the hypothermia. As the sound of sirens finally approached the palace gates, David reflected on the decision he had made. He had violated multiple protocols and potentially jeopardized his military career, but he had also saved a human life. Whatever consequences awaited him, he knew that he had made the right choice when faced with a situation where duty to humanity superseded duty to regulations. The paramedics who arrived at the palace gates were experienced professionals who had been dealing with cold-related emergencies throughout the night. Sarah Mitchell and James Conway had been responding to hypothermia cases across London for the past 6 hours, but they had never been called to Buckingham Palace before. The unusual location and the involvement of a royal guard made this rescue particularly memorable. When they were escorted to the guard station by palace security, the paramedics found Emma in significantly better condition than they had expected. Based on David's initial emergency call, Dr. Wells briefed them on the treatment she had provided, including Emma's temperature readings, vital signs, and the warming protocols that had already been implemented. Sarah Mitchell, though the senior paramedic, was impressed by the quality of care that Emma had received before their arrival. She later commented that Dr. Wells' immediate intervention had likely prevented Emma's condition from deteriorating to the point where permanent damage or death could have occurred. The rapid warming and medical stabilization had been exactly what Emma needed during the critical first hour of her rescue. As the paramedics prepared Emma for transport to St. Mary's Hospital, she insisted on thanking David personally for his actions. Despite her weakened condition, she was clearly emotional as she expressed her gratitude to the young guardsman who had literally saved her life. Emma told David that she would never forget his kindness and courage, and that she hoped to find a way to properly thank him once she had recovered. David was characteristically modest in his response, telling Emma that any soldier would have done the same thing in his position. He wished her well and assured her that her recovery was the only thanks he needed. His humble demeanor and genuine concern for her well-being made a deep impression on both Emma and the medical professionals who witnessed their interaction. After the ambulance departed for the hospital, David faced the immediate consequences of his decision to abandon his post. Major Sterling had arrived at the palace to conduct a preliminary review of the incident, and David knew that he would need to provide a detailed report explaining his actions and justifying his decision to violate established protocols. The meeting took place in Major Sterling's office, a formal room decorated with military honors and photographs of previous Royal Guard units. David stood at attention as he recounted the events of the evening, providing a clear and factual account of how he had identified the emergency situation and made the decision to intervene. Major Sterling listened carefully to David's report, asking detailed questions about the timing of events, his assessment of Emma's condition, and his decision-making process throughout the incident. The major was particularly interested in understanding how David had balanced his ceremonial duties with his responsibility as a soldier trained to protect and serve. David explained that his military training had taught him to recognize life-threatening emergencies, and that his assessment of Emma's condition had indicated that immediate action was necessary to prevent serious injury or death. He acknowledged that he had violated protocols by leaving his post and bringing a civilian onto palace grounds. But he emphasized that he had believed these actions were necessary to save a human life. Major Sterling's response revealed the complexity of military leadership in situations where rules and compassion come into conflict. While he had a responsibility to maintain discipline and ensure that protocols were followed, he also recognized that David had faced a genuine moral dilemma and had chosen to prioritize human life over regulatory compliance. The major explained that David's actions would need to be reviewed by higher authorities, including the Palace Security Command and potentially members of the royal household staff. While David's humanitarian motives were commendable, the security implications of his decisions could not be ignored, and there would need to be a formal investigation to determine whether any changes to protocols or training were necessary. However, Major Sterling also indicated that he personally supported David's actions and would recommend that any disciplinary measures take into account the life-saving nature of his intervention. He praised David's quick thinking, his proper assessment of the emergency situation, and his professional handling of the rescue operation. Dr. Wells also provided a written statement supporting David's actions, emphasizing that Emma's condition had been genuinely life-threatening and that David's quick response had been crucial to preventing a tragedy. Her medical expertise lent significant weight to the argument that David had faced a true emergency that justified his protocol violations. The incident quickly became known throughout the Royal Guard unit, and David found himself receiving support from his fellow guardsmen who admired his courage and compassion. Many of them privately admitted that they hoped they would have the same moral courage to act if faced with a similar situation. Word of the rescue also reached members of the palace, staff, and eventually the royal household itself. The story of the guardsman who had risked his career to save a stranger's life resonated with many people who saw it as an example of the values that the Royal Guard was meant to represent: duty, honor, and service to others. As the night shift ended and David finally returned to his quarters, he reflected on the events that had transformed what should have been a routine evening into a life-changing experience. He had discovered that sometimes the most important duties a soldier can perform have nothing to do with following orders and everything to do with following conscience. The young woman who had been struggling against the deadly cold was now safe, in a hospital bed, receiving the care she needed to make a full recovery. David had played a crucial role in saving her life. But he had also learned something important about himself and about the true meaning of service to others. The consequences of his actions remained to be determined, but he knew that he had made the right choice when it mattered most. The following morning brought unexpected developments that would change the trajectory of David's military career in ways he never could have anticipated. Emma Richardson's rescue had occurred during one of the coldest nights London had experienced in decades, and several news outlets were reporting on the extreme weather conditions and their impact on the city's emergency services. Dr. Amanda Foster, the emergency room physician who had treated Emma at St. Mary's Hospital, was contacted by a journalist writing about cold-related injuries from the previous night. During her interview, Dr. Foster mentioned the young woman who had been brought in suffering from severe hypothermia and praised the quick thinking of the Royal Guard who had initiated her rescue. The journalist Rebecca Matthews from the London Evening Standard immediately recognized the human interest potential of the story. A Royal Guard risking his career to save a stranger's life was exactly the kind of heartwarming news that readers craved, especially during the bleak winter months when negative stories dominated the headlines. Matthews contacted the palace press office requesting information about the incident, but was told that the matter was under internal review and that no official statement would be made until the investigation was complete. However, her inquiries had already begun to attract attention within the palace hierarchy, and word of the rescue quickly reached senior staff members. Meanwhile, is recovering well in the hospital under the care of Dr. Foster and her medical team. The warming protocols that had been initiated by Dr. Wells at the palace had prevented any permanent damage from the hypothermia, and Emma's vital signs had returned to normal within hours of her arrival at the hospital. When Emma learned from Dr. Foster that her rescue was attracting media attention, she insisted on speaking publicly about David's actions. Despite her family's concerns about privacy, Emma felt a strong moral obligation to ensure that the guardsman who had saved her life received proper recognition for his courage and compassion. Emma's statement to the press was heartfelt and compelling. She described how David had noticed her distress when no one else had, how he had risked his career to help a complete stranger, and how his quick action had literally saved her life. She emphasized that without his intervention, she would likely have collapsed from hypothermia and could have died from exposure on one of the coldest nights in London's recent history. The story quickly gained momentum across British media outlets. Television news programs picked up the account, newspapers featured it prominently, and social media platforms buzzed with discussions about the heroic Royal Guard who had put human compassion above military protocol. Public reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Readers and viewers expressed admiration for David's courage and criticized any suggestion that he should face disciplinary action for his life-saving intervention. Many people pointed out that his actions embodied the highest ideals of military service and reflected well on both the Royal Guard and the broader British military establishment. The positive media coverage and public support created a challenging situation for the palace administration. While they needed to maintain military discipline and ensure that protocols were respected, they also recognized that punishing a guardsman for saving someone's life would create a public relations nightmare and send the wrong message about the values of the institution. Colonel Henry Pemberton, the commanding officer of the Royal Guard Regiment, found himself in the difficult position of balancing military regulations with public expectations and humanitarian considerations. Colonel Pemberton had 30 years of military experience and had dealt with numerous disciplinary situations, but never one that involved such clear moral complexity. The colonel's initial review of the incident focused on the security implications of David's actions. Bringing an unauthorized civilian onto palace grounds was a serious breach that could have created vulnerabilities in the royal protection system. However, the review also acknowledged that David had followed proper procedures for medical emergencies and had maintained appropriate security awareness throughout the rescue operation. Dr. Wells' detailed medical report proved crucial in the colonel's assessment. Her professional opinion that Emma had been in immediate danger of death from hypothermia provided strong justification for David's decision to prioritize life-saving intervention over protocol compliance. The report also documented that David had acted professionally and responsibly throughout the emergency. As the media attention intensified, Colonel Pemberton received communications from various sources expressing support for David's actions. These included letters from medical professionals praising his recognition of hypothermia symptoms, messages from military veterans who understood the moral complexity of his situation, and numerous expressions of public support for his humanitarian instincts. The colonel also heard from Emma's family, who had traveled to London to be with their daughter during her recovery. Emma's parents, Robert and Linda Richardson, requested a meeting to personally thank David for saving their daughter's life and to express their support for him during the disciplinary review process. The meeting took place in Colonel Pemberton's office and proved to be an emotional encounter that highlighted the human impact of David's actions. Linda Richardson broke down in tears as she thanked David for her daughter's life, explaining that Emma was their only child and that losing her would have destroyed their family. Robert Richardson, former police officer, expressed his professional admiration for David's quick assessment of the emergency situation and his decisive action under pressure. He pointed out that David's military training and humanitarian instincts had worked together perfectly to produce the best possible outcome in a life-threatening situation. The meeting reinforced Colonel Pemberton's growing conviction that David's actions, while technically violations of protocol, had been morally justified and professionally executed. The colonel began to see the incident not as a disciplinary problem, but as an example of the kind of character and judgment that the Royal Guard sought to develop in its personnel. As the review process continued, it became clear that David's rescue of Emma Richardson had become more than just a military disciplinary matter. It had evolved into a test case for how institutions balance rules with humanity, and how they respond when their members face moral dilemmas that require choosing between competing loyalties and responsibilities. The formal disciplinary hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving Colonel Pemberton and the palace administration time to thoroughly review all aspects of the incident. During this period, the story continued to generate positive media coverage and public support that extended far beyond typical news cycles. Emma Richardson was discharged from the hospital on Friday morning, having made a complete recovery from her hypothermia, with no lasting effects. Her first action upon leaving the hospital was to visit Buckingham Palace, hoping to personally thank David for his life-saving intervention before his disciplinary hearing. The palace initially declined Emma's request for a meeting, citing the ongoing internal review process. However, the persistence of media attention and the overwhelming public support for David's actions prompted palace officials to reconsider their position. They recognized that allowing Emma to express her gratitude publicly might help demonstrate the positive outcome of David's decision. The meeting was arranged for Saturday afternoon in a private reception room within the palace. Emma was accompanied by her parents and was visibly emotional as she waited to meet the man who had saved her life. When David entered the room in his dress uniform, Emma immediately stood and expressed her heartfelt gratitude for his courage and compassion. David remained characteristically modest during the meeting, emphasizing that he had simply done what his training and conscience had demanded in an emergency situation. However, Emma's parents were able to convey to him the profound impact his actions had had on their entire family, and how his quick thinking had prevented what could have been an unthinkable tragedy. During their conversation, Emma revealed additional details about her experience that night that further validated David's assessment of the emergency. She described how she had been becoming increasingly confused and disoriented as the hypothermia progressed, and how she had been losing the ability to think clearly about finding help or shelter. Emma explained that she had been trying to flag down passing vehicles but had been unsuccessful because drivers were focused on navigating the dangerous road conditions. She had been growing increasingly desperate and frightened as she realized that she was in serious trouble, but was losing the mental capacity to effectively seek assistance. Most significantly, Emma told David that she remembered feeling like she was beginning to give up hope just before he appeared. The extreme cold was making her want to lie down and rest, which she now understood would likely have been fatal. David's intervention had come at the exact moment when she was losing the will and ability to continue fighting for her survival. This revelation reinforced the life-saving nature of David's actions and provided additional evidence that his quick response had been crucial to preventing a tragedy. Emma's account made it clear that even a few more minutes of exposure could have resulted in her collapse and potential death from hypothermia. The meeting concluded with Emma presenting David with a handwritten letter expressing her gratitude and her commitment to ensuring that his heroic actions received proper recognition. She also announced her intention to speak at his disciplinary hearing if permitted, believing that her first-hand testimony about the emergency would be crucial to the proceedings. Over the weekend, additional support for David emerged from unexpected sources. The Royal British Legion, an organization representing military veterans, issued a statement praising David's actions and calling for recognition rather than punishment. Several medical organizations also expressed support, noting that David's recognition of hypothermia symptoms and his immediate response had demonstrated excellent emergency awareness. Perhaps most significantly, members of the royal family themselves began to take notice of the situation. While palace protocol prevented them from making public statements about internal disciplinary matters, private communication suggested that there was considerable sympathy for David's position and appreciation for the positive publicity his actions had generated. On Sunday evening, Colonel Pemberton received a communication from the private secretary to the Queen, indicating that the royal household was aware of the situation and was supportive of a resolution that would recognize David's humanitarian instincts while maintaining appropriate military discipline. This high-level attention signaled that the case had transcended normal disciplinary procedures. The colonel spent Sunday night reviewing all the evidence, testimonies, and communications related to the incident. His assessment concluded that David had faced a genuine emergency situation, had made appropriate decisions based on his training and moral judgment, and had executed the rescue professionally and effectively. More importantly, Colonel Pemberton recognized that David's actions had demonstrated exactly the kind of character, courage, and humanitarian instincts that the Royal Guard sought to embody. Rather than representing a failure of discipline, the incident showcased the values that made the Royal Guard a respected institution. The colonel's final report recommended that no disciplinary action be taken against David, but instead proposed that his actions be formally recognized as an example of exceptional service that went beyond normal military duties. The report suggested that David's rescue of Emma Richardson demonstrated the Royal Guard's commitment to protecting and serving all members of the public, not just the royal family. As Monday morning arrived and the disciplinary hearing approached, David prepared himself for whatever outcome awaited him. He had no regrets about his actions and remained convinced that he had made the right choice. When faced with a life-threatening emergency, the overwhelming public support and Emma's gratitude had been deeply meaningful to him. But his primary satisfaction came from knowing that he had stayed true to his values when it mattered most. The hearing would determine not just David's future with the Royal Guard, but would also set an important precedent for how the military institution balanced regulations with humanitarian responsibilities. The young guardsman who had risked his career to save a stranger was about to discover that sometimes doing the right thing leads to recognition rather than punishment. The disciplinary hearing convened at 9 o'clock on Monday morning in the formal conference room at Wellington Barracks, the headquarters of the Guards Division. David entered the room in his dress uniform, maintaining the same composed bearing that had characterized his service throughout his 3 years with the Royal Guard. The panel consisted of Colonel Pemberton, Major Sterling, and Brigadier Sir Richard Ashworth, who had been appointed to provide an independent perspective on the proceedings. Also present were Dr. Wells, who would testify about the medical aspects of the emergency, and Emma Richardson, who had been granted permission to provide her first-hand account of the incident. Brigadier Ashworth opened the hearing by acknowledging the unusual nature of the case and the significant public attention it had generated. He emphasized that the panel's responsibility was to evaluate David's actions according to military regulations, while also considering the humanitarian circumstances that had prompted his decisions. Colonel Pemberton presented his comprehensive review of the incident, detailing David's recognition of the emergency situation, his assessment of Emma's condition, and his professional handling of the rescue operation. The colonel's report emphasized that David had demonstrated exceptional situational awareness and had made decisions consistent with his training as both a soldier and a guardian of public safety. Dr. Wells testified about Emma's medical condition. When she arrived at the guard station, confirming that she was suffering from severe hypothermia that posed an immediate threat to her life, the doctor explained that David's quick recognition of the symptoms and his decision to move Emma to a heated environment had been medically appropriate and had prevented her condition from deteriorating further. Emma's testimony proved to be the most compelling part of the hearing. Speaking with quiet dignity, she described her experience on that freezing night, her growing confusion and desperation as the hypothermia progressed, and her profound gratitude for David's intervention. She emphasized that without his actions, she believed she would have collapsed and potentially died from exposure. Emma also addressed the broader implications of David's actions, pointing out that his willingness to risk his career to help a stranger demonstrated exactly the kind of character and values that made the Royal Guard a respected institution. She argued that punishing him for saving her life would send the wrong message about the priorities and values of the military. The panel also heard from several character witnesses, including David's fellow guardsmen, who testified about his professionalism, integrity, and dedication to duty throughout his service. These testimonies painted a picture of a soldier who consistently demonstrated good judgment and moral courage in various situations. Major Sterling testified about David's exemplary service record, noting that he had never before violated any protocols or procedures during his 3 years of service. The Major emphasized that David's actions during the rescue had been consistent with his overall character and his commitment to serving others. When called upon to speak in his own defense, David delivered a brief but powerful statement that reflected his military training and personal values. He acknowledged that he had violated protocols by leaving his post and bringing Emma onto palace grounds, but explained that he had believed these actions were necessary to prevent a human tragedy. David emphasized that his military training had taught him to recognize life-threatening emergencies and to take appropriate action to protect human life. He stated that while he understood the importance of following regulations, he believed that the preservation of human life took precedence when the two came into conflict. Most importantly, David expressed no regret about his actions and stated that he would make the same decisions again if faced with similar circumstances. His statement demonstrated the moral courage and conviction that had prompted his original decision to help Emma, and it clearly impressed the members of the disciplinary panel. After hearing all the testimony and evidence, the panel retired to deliberate for approximately 1 hour. When they returned, Brigadier Ashworth announced their unanimous decision, which would have far-reaching implications not only for David but for future Royal Guard protocols and training. The panel found that David's actions, while technically violations of standard protocols, had been morally justified and professionally executed. They determined that he had correctly assessed a life-threatening emergency situation and had taken appropriate action to save a human life while maintaining proper security awareness throughout the operation. Rather than imposing disciplinary measures, the panel recommended that David receive formal recognition for his exceptional service and humanitarian actions. They proposed that his rescue of Emma Richardson be cited as an example of the Royal Guard's commitment to serving and protecting all members of the public. Brigadier Ashworth announced that David would be awarded the Royal Humane Society's testimonial on parchment, a prestigious honor recognizing his life-saving actions. Additionally, his actions would be formally commended in his service record, and he would be considered for accelerated promotion in recognition of his exceptional judgment and character. The panel also recommended changes to Royal Guard protocols to provide clearer guidance for handling emergency situations involving civilians. These changes would ensure that future guardsmen would have explicit authority to take life-saving actions when faced with similar circumstances. The hearing concluded with personal congratulations from each panel member, who praised David's courage, integrity, and humanitarian instincts. Brigadier Ashworth noted that David's actions had brought honor to the Royal Guard and had demonstrated the finest traditions of British military service. Emma Richardson, who had waited outside during the deliberations, was among the first to congratulate David when the decision was announced. Her tears of relief and gratitude highlighted the profound impact its actions had had on her life and the lives of her family members. In the weeks that followed, David returned to his duties with the Royal Guard, but his experience had changed him in subtle ways. He had learned that sometimes the most important service a soldier can provide has nothing to do with military operations and everything to do with basic human compassion. The story of David Thompson and Emma Richardson became a lasting example of how individual courage and moral conviction can make the difference between life and death. It demonstrated that true heroism often occurs not on battlefields, but in quiet moments when someone chooses to risk everything to help a fellow human being in desperate need. David's willingness to put Emma's life ahead of his career had not only saved her from a potentially fatal situation, but had also reinforced the values and traditions that made the Royal Guard a symbol of honor and service throughout the Commonwealth and beyond. Asterisk.